Buckle up for AEC Trailblazers, the Founders Files, where we crack open the stories of the brightest minds in the AEC startup scene. Forget institutional pitches. We're diving deep into the real personal journeys of these industry disruptors. Get ready for some casual chats firsthand.
Hello, and welcome again to another episode of the AEC Trailblazers podcast, where we interview the most amazing founders of the AEC scene. Today with us, we have Josh Graham. Josh is a climate tech entrepreneur and CEO of eHub, a UK-based startup developing weather risk management software for the construction industry. He's also the co-founder of the Climate Venture Collective and passionate advocate for sustainable solutions. Hi, Josh.
Hey, Valentin. How are you getting on?
Good. Oh, man. I excited to have a British guy here. Your accent is going to be so amazing for this episode.
I will do my best.
You don't have to do much. That's the good thing about it.
No, I'm really looking forward to this. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for being here. As a warm-up, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? How you got involved on the first place on our industry?
Yeah, it's a pretty wild story, I guess. So I was always really passionate about climate. I studied climate science at university, and pretty much straight out of uni, I knew I wanted to start my own projects. So I went and did some charity stuff. I went and did various kind of social enterprises. And I eventually met a few people in tech and realized that maybe I could have a bigger impact if I were to go into the world of tech. And you know, when you're first starting out, you're thinking, okay, what's a really big industry? What's an industry that has lots of challenges, but also has lots of potential? And from a climate perspective, construction is, one of the biggest polluters. It's a massive industry in terms of market. So we started to kind of speak to construction folks, and problems that kept coming up, like time and time again, whenever we kind of asked, what's a problem that for you around climate or around kind of the climate space, people kept mentioning the weather. And so from really starting out, the charity I started out of uni was around food waste and helping get food waste to go to folks in need of food. I then pivoted into tech, and then that tech journey has led me into construction, which is a very different world. So as many startup founders might realize, the journey can sometimes be quite unpredictable, but I wouldn't have had it any other way.
Interesting. Like you said, our industry it's not one of the biggest. It's the biggest industry out there, if you consider real estate as well, right? And it's also the biggest polluter. It's just insane that we're using some materials that we have been using materials for thousands of years, not only hundreds. And that needs to change for sure. How was your first approach to your industry? Like, you decided to go straight with doing something with weather, or you were considering any other option when you were getting into our industry?
Yeah, so back in, I think it was 2019, me and my co-founder Felipe were on like an accelerator, which, yeah, for those who don't know, it's a place where startups can go to try to refine their ideas. They sometimes get a little bit of money. So in this case, we got a little bit of money and kind of support and mentors. And that was actually like a blockchain focused accelerator. So it was trying to help people unlock business use cases for blockchain technology. And we actually first started looking at supply chains. So, a classic example with blockchains is to track different things as they move through the supply chain and try to help create traceability, but also various efficiencies with the signing of documents and that sort of thing. So that was actually the first time we kind of encountered some construction use cases. But then it was at that point when we were chatting to people about it, as I mentioned, they kept mentioning weather being this problem. And so quite quickly we realized, weather doesn't seem to be a problem that's being tackled. And from all of the people we were speaking to, it kind of, everyone kept using this phrase, which you, Valentin, you might know, I've heard this before, but everyone uses a gut feel. Everyone kind of finger in the air, whether, yeah, I'm going to kind of fudge the numbers or come up with something that sounds reasonable. And that's pretty much the standard approach, even on multi-billion-dollar projects, right? Is to kind of not take a data or science-based approach. And to me and Felipe, who come from a world of tech and climate science and data, that felt like a very strange approach. So it felt like an obvious place where we could see, leveraging data, leveraging a better practice would bring benefits to the industry. So I think my first reaction was kind of, is this really how it works? Is this really how the industry does things? Because I think there's this thing, isn't there, of if you're not from the industry, you don't know all the ins and outs of it. So how can you build a solution for that industry? But I think in our case, it was helpful because it allowed us to kind of say, well, what does the best version of this process look like? Okay, and now how can we make it so that it's accessible for people in the industry to use? So I think instead of coming with all the baggage that we might have had if we had been planners or schedulers ourselves, we kind of took that approach of, well, let's just reimagine the process and make it as streamlined as possible so that, we can optimize it for folks in the industry.
That's interesting because it's exactly like it is. Like in every construction project, you go with your gut feeling related to weather, unless you're in a really extreme weather that you have to consider it seriously. But why do you think it was done that way in our industry? You think it's because the impact on each project is not big, or why do you think we were doing things like that before EHAB existed?
Yeah, I think probably a lot of different reasons. Some of the things that I've come across would be like, to be a bit cynical, maybe weather is quite a good excuse that people can use when they're contracting. And so if there's not a lot of certainty or ambiguity around it, it leaves wiggle room for people when they're making claims or whatever that might be. So that's a bit of a cynical view. I think a more practical perspective might be that when you don't know the size of the problem, when you don't know how much the cost of that problem is, then it becomes quite difficult to prioritize, right? Probably people focus on what's the thing right now that's hitting my wallet the most. And because weather has rarely, if ever, been in the top one, it's maybe the top 5 or top 10 risks on most projects, but it's not the top one. And so it kind of slips down the priority order. And you think, well, maybe we can gain a few percentage points by optimizing the weather, which still could be millions or billions, by the way, if your portfolio is big. But I think now more than ever, because of the way that climate change is changing weather patterns, it's making these extreme events more likely to occur. It's forcing its way up that priority order. So a lot of the folks I've spoken to, maybe it was a top 10 in the past, it's now a top 5. For those, it was a top 5, it's now a top 3. And of course, if you're doing offshore projects, then it is the number one risk. And we've seen an explosion in offshore projects because of the wind sector. And so there's just more exposure now because of the complexity of projects, because of the types of projects that are happening, and because of the climate crisis.
Interesting. How big is, like, would you give me a threshold of how much it can be the impact in terms of, I don't know, the percentage of the total cost of building, or just to get an idea of how big it could be the impact?
Yeah. So it's really interesting. We did this piece of work when we first started out to try to size the problem in the industry, and it was about 9.5%. So yeah, if the industry in 2020 was like $11 trillion, then it's just under $1 trillion is likely the impact of that delay. And that's not something that necessarily any one party is losing. It's spread out across the whole industry, but still $1 trillion problem is a big problem. What we've now been tracking is, it's really scary to kind of see in the data, but since 2015, there's been this really steep curve. You can see it in the data where the likelihood of impact and the size of impact on all of the different types of activities that construction companies are undertaking, that impact has gone up in a really steep way. And so really in the last 4 years since we started kind of tracking in 2020, that 9.5% has risen to between 12 and 17%, kind of averaging, depending on the type of project you're looking at. And on offshore projects, it's 30%, right? So if you look at whatever the offshore wind sector's value is, probably about 30% of that is weather. And then, if you just look at the average, 12 to 17. So that's a big number.
That's a huge number. Just only 10% is just huge. Like 17 or 30% is just insane. If you're not insane, if you're not considering it, right, on your project. And do you think this affects more on, for sure, there are extreme examples like offshore buildings that, or if you have a building in the middle of I don't know, the desert or Antarctica, but which one do you feel in general, like average, has like bigger risks related to weather? Is it big projects? This also applies to smaller projects as well. The scale varies depending on the size of the project.
It's a good question, and this gets to the crux of how difficult it's been to build our product, because weather impacts projects in so many different ways, and because there's so many various types of projects, it's a tricky question to answer. So for offshore projects, a barge can cost 250 grand a day to rent. And so every lost day because of, choppy seas or high waves or high winds is going to impact the prelim cost of you renting that barge and your ability to have a productivity gain on your schedule. So there's clear kind of issues on offshore. It's just actually getting to the location and making sure the location has safe operating conditions for us to work in. A recent phenomenon from kind of climate change is these kind of flash flood events, where because you've had high temperatures baking the ground, it's made the ground less permeable, and then you have these heavy rainfall events because extreme rainfall events are becoming more likely. And so you're then seeing surface flooding occurring in places where it wouldn't really have occurred before. And that could impact, if you're building a hospital and you're in the foundations, you're in the ground, or if you're building roads, or if you're building any type of infrastructure. And if that type of event happens at that moment, then you're going to be in trouble. That can even have implications on your insurance, where damage might actually occur and you have to then reclaim from your insurance and start again. And I think there's other interesting things. I was speaking the other day at a webinar around health and safety. So the summer has traditionally been when you get most of your work done, right? Of course, it's the best weather. But as you kind of start to see temperatures increasing over about 28, 29 degrees, the productivity of workers starts to drop. They're more likely to have accidents, make mistakes. So rework is more likely. And then as it gets into those extreme temperature days, which of course that's kind of the fundamental thing, isn't it? We're seeing more of these hot days. It has serious implications for people's internal organs, skin cancer exposure. So there's kind of some of these longer term health implications that I think the workforce will see in the coming years around that health and safety element as well. So I don't think summer is any more that kind of, let's get all of our earthworks, we'll just be able to completely get it done. Of course, it will still be a productive time of year, but there'll be these new things that are coming to bear. I don't know if that answers your question, Valentin. I could go on all day about the various impacts.
No, but it makes sense, and it's really interesting. Not only the fact that it's true, like summer used to be the time where you do more of your work. Even like I think in Europe, United States, New Zealand, places where winter it's hard, and the only option or viable option you have in some places is to build stuff during the summer. But like I think I told you this, but I used to work in Vegas. I lived there for a long time, and construction sites where the laws were completely different. Like construction workers were able to take rest every 2 hours, I think it was, or every an hour and a half. You need to have, I think it was ice and water, not further than, I think it was 20 meters from each construction worker. Like, there are so many things that were different. And I remember that was the case only in Vegas, but I've seen other states where this never happened in the past. And now, because what happens is when temperatures are going above, 38, 37, or for Americans, 100, 105, construction sites are shut down in most states. So now they're considering, well, we cannot shut down. One day it's not a big problem, but if I have to shut down my construction site 10 days or 15 days a month, that's too much. So they need to change laws and the way it works and adapt to places like Las Vegas, which has been hot forever. I don't know if you see that trend also changing in with your clients as well.
Yeah, exactly. I think the bit that is a struggle for construction companies is that the data that you've probably relied on for so long around your productivity rates, like, if we're in Vegas, we can get 100 meters of concreting done every day. It's just not going to be the same anymore. And often what people are doing is they're looking back at their historic averages of how they've completed work in certain regions. And that just isn't cutting the amount of contingency that they really need to put in their schedule. So I think that's going to be a tricky thing for people to come to terms with, because one of the interesting things that first happened when we first started having clients putting data into our platform and seeing the results that were coming out, they was thinking 20, 30, 50 days. How is it that many days? And then we started to then show them and back test against, well, this is how many down days that site actually had. And the numbers were just aligning. And the reason is because of these changes. So yeah, in some of the places that are already hot, they're going to get much hotter. Often they're going to get much drier as well. And then in places that are already kind of wet, like the UK, only going to get wetter. It's only going to get wetter. So yeah, you kind of see some of these things playing out across the North and South American continents as well. Like I think it's the west coast of that whole North and South American continent is going to kind of get wetter. Past the Rockies is just going to get drier and drier, and there's various other impacts that will occur, obviously, over time. But it's both fascinating and scary to kind of see those things happening. And I think one final point really on that kind of seasonality and changeability we've had in the last couple of years. I don't know if you've noticed this in the kind of the climate news, but El Nino and La Nina type events. So these are kind of 5 to 7 year cycles generally of where the climate system is going to have these certain spikes, and that again has an influence. But scientists are also seeing the cycles shorten and those events become more extreme as well. So there's an unpredictability of what was once kind of 5 to 7 year cycle. Maybe they're going to be happening less regularly or more irregularly, and those influences will be stronger as well.
That's also interesting. How do you deal, because you have to deal with weather, and given the fact that weather is getting so unpredictable, how do you deal with that? Like, you have to adjust your models all the time, or how do you deal with the unpredictability of the weather?
So it's a really good point. Our head of data, Paolo, will be pinching me with my explanation of this, but I guess there's a couple of things. So the first is, and we realized this really early on, that trying to predict the weather is just flat out super difficult. Like the biggest supercomputers in the world can't really accurately forecast the weather more than a couple of weeks, right? Like Google now has a really good AI driven model, which is good for about 10 days. But if someone's giving you a medium term, 3-month forecast, it's like slightly better than a coin toss, which obviously isn't very helpful. But in construction, you don't necessarily want to know exactly what the weather's doing. You just want to know, well, can I do my crane operation? Can I pour concrete? And there will be, set thresholds around these. Like, I know I can't pour below 3 degrees, or I can't pour above 35 or something along those lines, right? That might be the thresholds that I would set for my concrete activity. And so instead of saying, well, what's the weather going to be? It's just, well, is it going to break that threshold? And so that kind of probabilistic modeling achieves much higher accuracy in the results, because we're not trying to specifically model the weather. We're just modeling the impact from that weather. And so that's one piece. And then how we actually get that model we've built to be more accurate. And so machine learning is the other piece that makes that model work. So we let the machine learning algorithm in the model look at the data, all the historic data, the 50 years of historic data, and we let it pick the best sources for wind or for wave or for rain. And we let it pick the optimal combination of those for predicting the future impact. So you can imagine it's done all its algorithms, and it then will say, okay, let's use the data from 2015 backwards to predict the next 5 years. And we will then backtest to say, well, did we get it right in 2016? Did we get it right in 2017? When we have got that as accurate as possible, we then use that set of settings in the model. So the model kind of trains itself to be the best, give the best outputs for a specific location. And that will happen, every time a contractor drops a new pin on the map. That's happening all very quickly when the model is getting built. And so it's kind of self-optimizing.
That's really interesting. And I bet that given the nature of the weather, that it's changing so much, it's the only option, that you have a model that it's evolving all the time, because it's going to be more unpredictable every year, right? But also I'm curious, because how, like, let's say I wanna use the tool and I have a construction site. If I have to build a building that it's, 3 blocks away, the data is going to be exactly the same? Or when do you see variations? So it's per lot, per block, per city, per state? Or how does the calculation of the variations? Let's say the 2 buildings are exactly the same, right? Like I'm just going to copy and paste two buildings that are exactly the same. When I'm going to be able to see variations on based on the location of the building?
Yeah, it's a really good question. In reality, a block away can be a world away, right? Yeah, you've probably been on projects where in a city, because of the way that the buildings are, that's going to have influences on the wind, which is a common problem in urban centers, where you might be on Main Street and that's funneling the wind and it's much, much quicker than the average speed, and then you might be round a corner and it's really sheltered. That's a really tricky problem. Right now in the system, it's every few kilometers. So we're at about a 9-kilometer grid, which a few miles apart, and you'll start to get differences in the data. In North America and Europe, we're about to kind of go down to a 1.5 kilometer grid. So again, like a mile-ish. That's going to be, much more accurate and provide better insights for people working, in a city level. We've got a couple of other things that we're doing, again, using kind of smart data techniques, where you can use elevation models to help improve temperature down to literally like a 5 meter squared. Those wind models in cities are more complicated. So we're looking at ways that we could, again, use the kind of elevation of buildings to start to infer some better information around it. So there's lots to be done there. And I think Google and probably lots of others as well, but are working really, really hard on leveraging their artificial intelligence models around weather and climate, because it is such a big problem, not just in construction, in every industry. Clearly, weather is having a big impact. So I think we're going to continue to see some really exciting gains being made in those spaces. Luckily, we don't have to do all the heavy lifting. We can work with these other partners who are.
So this question might not be like related with EHAB, but being the fact that you're a sustainability advocate, and being the fact that, like we said, our industry is kind of one of the biggest polluters in the world, related with mostly with materials and processes of the actual construction. How do you feel regarding to that? It's something that you think it's changing, or it's the same?
It's a great question. The scale of the challenge is really, really, really huge. Everyone's got this concept of net zero, right? Like we have to get to zero emissions. Technically, we have to do better than that. Like we have to be kind of negative emissions, ideally, because otherwise, it's great to get to 2 degrees of warming and stop it there, but that's still locked in a lot of warming. And we can see we're at 1.4, 1.3, 1.4 now. And you can see how much more extreme things are. And that, as you crank up that dial, it only gets worse in an exponential direction. So we actually need to be negative, carbon negative. And we also have a growing population still. I know like maybe things are slowing down, but there's still a lot of, I think I heard this stat, which was like 75% of the urban areas that need to be built are still yet to be built. So even if you just think about concrete and steel, how much of that stuff do we still need to build the buildings that we need to house all of the growing population of the earth? Because I think we all agree that they should all live in a very good standard of living. So yeah, it's tricky. But that being said, there are lots of really smart people who are trying to solve these problems. And I think as soon as you see price parity, then as you've seen with renewable energy, which is now significantly the cheapest electric form of electricity generation, then you can see things really expanding. Now, specifically in construction, I really like that so many companies now have these sustainability teams and they've signed up for pledges, and they seem to have a much better attitude towards it than they did in the past. And the NEC, like many other standard forms of contract, now have a clause around carbon. So for some of these government contracts in the UK, there are certain carbon commitments that are being made. That's a fantastic start, and we just need more of that more quickly. And there's a point that I was going to make later on, but the workforce is changing in construction, isn't it? Right? There's a shortage of skills, but the folks who are coming into the industry are much younger. Their attitudes towards technology they're much more willing to experiment and try new things. And I think that attitude will extend to the climate side of things as well, and sustainability side of things as well. So that's what really encourages me, is the fact that, in the next 10, 20 years, which are the most important decades really for this century, we're going to have a real wave of fresh people coming into decision making, both on the client side, the people who are building the things, and also on the contractor and subcontractor side as well.
No, that's a really positive view, and I do agree. I do agree on most of it, that like until we have parity with sustainable solutions, like you said, energy, or until we have a concrete that it's more sustainable, but it's the same price and can structurally can be the same, and the properties can be all the same, on the exception that it's that is more sustainable, people are not going to change the way they build, whether because governments needs to, lower taxes on materials that are more sustainable so you can get price parity, or it doesn't matter, but you need that. And the same applies to the type of design. If design is much more expensive, or if you don't have a return of investment in the short term or more long term, because you're going to need, I don't know, less AC, or you're going to need less energy to, designers are going to do that. Like, and it's the reality. Like, if you're a real estate developer, like, you need to consider return of investment. And if there is no return of investment, you don't do it. So I think that's going to be the challenge. And I do agree, a lot of people are working on this. And at the beginning, I feel it's like anything, you're more on the, experimental realm, where you don't consider so much the cost because there is nothing done. But I feel that we're past that specific phase, and we're now just taking more solutions and practical solutions that are really cheaper or the same price, whether it is, materials or processes. So I do agree it's improving. I don't know if the speed is as fast as we need, like you said, because even when you say net zero, so sometimes like the way it's measured, the net zero is like, hey, my materials are net zero. Yeah, but are you accounting the gasoline the guy used for the transportation? No, well, then it's not theoretically net zero. So I also agree that we need to have carbon negative buildings, because like, if you're carbon negative, worst case scenario is that you're not carbon negative and you're going to be net zero. But now being net zero typically is being still carbon positive.
Well, it's a question back to you, maybe, because you clearly think about this in the AEC space as well. You've heard of the thing called crossing the chasm?
Yeah.
There's this element, isn't there, of crossing the chasm in the climate space. Maybe there's like two chasms, because you have to prove that it reduces carbon and has sustainability impact. And then, as you said, it has to also basically be as cheap or, very similar cost. So I don't know if you think that makes it doubly hard for those building sustainability solutions to get them to market and get them appropriately scaled.
Yeah, no, I do agree. I always like to get analogies from other industries. And if you consider like a vaccine, right? Like, sometimes when you create a vaccine, it works, and it doesn't matter if it's cheap or extremely expensive. You get the vaccine anyway because you're going to die. You don't have an option, right? Like, it's the vaccine or nothing. In the construction industry, you always have other options. Like, there is nothing that forbids you to use, like, I don't know, let's say regular concrete, or a concrete that it's 10 times more polluting than others. And nowadays we have a couple of regulations for sure, and it's getting better, but still so much to do there. And you have still have so many options. So I agree. It's double the effort. It's not only creating something, but you need to also manufacture it in a way that is going to be cheaper, or, I don't know, convince politics to make regulations that make it cheaper. I don't know what's the better way to do it, but I agree, it's much harder.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for governments. They've obviously can change regulation, but they also do, like in the UK, national highways, Network Rail, they're kind of they're funded by the government, and they invest into all of the infrastructure. And so they could be making plans which kind of say, like, look, by 2026, we want to be spending 50% of our concrete budget on green concrete. Do you know what I mean? Where they can start to create the pipelines and the demand that helps scale up a technology. And maybe there is like a low carbon concrete framework where there's multiple bidders who bid for that, so that there's not just one winner, but multiple winners who can then scale up their product for different use cases. But I'm sure there's some innovation there around contracting and business models that would help support the fundamental innovation of lowering the concrete in the carbon, the carbon in the concrete. Sorry.
Yeah, and I also think is like not only governments but the market itself is going to change, right? As soon as you suffer, it's like if you suffer, it's really cold outside. You're not going to buy a house that doesn't have a way to heat your house, right? Like, or if it's too hot outside, you live in the desert. Most likely, you're going to buy a house with AC. So I think that as soon as, and I don't think it's a positive thing, but at the same time, it is. If the weather keeps being more and more extreme, people are going to get more worried about it, and people who have money to buy properties, they're going to get worried about it. And they're going to be like, you know what? I'm not going to buy a property that, the energy that uses, or if it's not net zero, if it's not carbon negative. The same thing happens with, like microwaves or microwave ovens or fridges, or like, those labels you get and the amount of energy they consume. I think, and people get worried about it. The same is going to happen with properties, and then developers will need to do it because otherwise people are not going to buy their properties. So I think it's going to be a mix between the government and then the market evolving because the weather is getting more extreme. But it takes time. I remember, I don't know, I think it was a scene from Mad Men where they're doing a picnic and then after the picnic, they throw all the garbage and they just leave the garbage out there. That was how things work, I don't know, 40, 30 years ago. Nowadays, we all know that you cannot throw garbage on the street. So I think it's just a process that takes time.
Yeah. No, I agree. I don't think that any one party has the only role to play. Of course, some have bigger than others. But as you were speaking, Valentin, it gave me a good thread because the insurance industry, who we work with quite closely, weather is a massive driver of their losses. And obviously they're private industry, right? But they have a massive incentive to encourage and possibly even mandate their insureds, the contractors, the people building the buildings, or the owners, the operators, to manage their risks in much better ways because it will have knock-on positive effects for their profit margins. So I think I get this thing all the time where maybe smaller companies who are maybe slightly less mature in their thinking, they kind of say, well, Josh, why would I analyze my plan and add more risk into my project? It's just going to make me uncompetitive. And I think in the super short term, for certain clients, that might be the case. But I think in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, every insurer, maybe even every bank who's lending to these projects, they're going to have fundamental clauses for when they're lending or insuring that is going to say, if you don't have a resilient approach to climate, to weather, then we're either going to give you much worse rates, so your insurance and your loans will be more expensive, or we won't do it at all because we know that you're going to more likely to default on your loan. We are more likely to make a claim to us. So that's a market force that, because of the impacts they're experiencing, will then pass back onto the industry. So I think you're right. There are some of these inbuilt things in the market where even the laggards will eventually transition to being more sustainable or being more resilient because of these kind of natural forces built into the market.
That's a really, really good example. And I'm also curious that now you're speaking about the future, what's in the roadmap for EHAB in the next, 5, 10 years?
Global domination, Valentin. Global domination. No, I think we've seen this in so many markets where maybe 3 years ago in the UK, people were much less mature in their thinking around weather risk. And now so many companies in the UK are coming to us and asking, how can we have better processes around this? And I think almost every construction market around the world that is starting to feel these effects from climate change are going to go through these cycles of, oh, wow, what we've been doing to date is not fit for purpose anymore. What are the options out there? And we're in a really lucky position where the only option in the construction industry right now that is us, really, that's leading the way. There are lots of other data providers. There are lots of other ways that you could do it, but it requires quite a lot of effort. It requires almost a data science team in your company. Some companies do have data science teams, and obviously some will go to the kind of the big players just to get data. But we really want to position ourselves as the go-to company where you can kind of get all of your weather risk needs met. So just earlier this year, we launched a new app called Climacast. It's like a companion app for designers and engineers so that when they're actually designing buildings, 2050, 2080, 2100, those assets are going to be able to withstand the heavy rainfall or the high temperatures that they're going to experience. We want to be building features that are more useful for the operations of assets as well. So, we talked about barges earlier when you're building wind farms, but clearly you need to repair your wind farms on an ongoing basis whenever something goes down or whatever it might be. And it's still expensive to have to understand when you're going to get barge availability to be able to transport in and out from shore. So we're trying to build more features around that. So I think there's so many use cases across that life cycle from design through to the actual operation of the asset where there just isn't a solution today. People are operations managers, risk managers, they're just reliant again on that, either their gut feel or a basic weather forecast, and that's it. So that's where we want to play. We want to be the solution where you've got a weather problem in the built environment. EHAB is the go-to place for you to solve that.
Nice. Thanks so much for sharing all that. It's really interesting what you guys are doing, and I do feel that there are many companies doing this kind of work on our industry. So I love it, to be honest. It's really original, and the impact is huge. So that's great. But before we wrap this up, can I ask you a couple of ping pong questions?
Yes, please do.
All right. What do you think is the next big trend in the AC?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. It's I kind of touched on it earlier, right? Where because we've got this workforce that's replacing the two kind of trends. One is kind of maybe again a bit cliche, but AI I think will become more of play a role in automating processes. But I think that will be compounded by the fact that there'll be younger people in those workforces. So they'll be much keener to use AI, and they'll be much keener to build automated workflows that replaces maybe some of the busy work that unfortunately happens today.
Cool. If you could collaborate with any person in history, which person would you choose?
Oh, it would have to be Buckminster Fuller. All the geodesic domes. So he has a lot of really good quotes about, if you want to change the world, you have to build a new system that replaces the existing system by being better than that system. So I think he just has a really good attitude towards things.
Yeah, he has really great ideas. He was pretty original because he started speaking about this like decades ago. So interesting. Yeah. Outside the AC, what are your hobbies or activities you have passion for?
I just love nature so much. So going out for hikes, going rock climbing, going trail running in the mountains or going surfing in the sea, just like anything where I'm, out in nature.
Nice. And finally, what's your favorite building in the world? Have you ever visited? Please don't say the walkie-talkie.
I have been to the walkie-talkie, not my favorite. I really, really want to go to this place. I've seen so many incredible photos and kind of like drone shots. So in English, I think it's called the Island of 1,000 Temples. It's in Cambodia. It's called Angkor Wat.
Angkor Wat.
Yeah, it looks very mystical. It's just a huge temple complex over a massive span on all these little islands, and it just looks incredible and so complex that I don't know how many thousands of years ago these effectively pyramids were built. So yeah, I would love to go there.
That's a really good one. I've been there, and
Yeah.
like 10 years ago, and it's such an amazing place.
You recommend?
You have to go really early because like everybody's there trying to watch the sunrise with the, I think Mortal Kombat was recorded, a part of Mortal Kombat was recorded there on the main temple when the sun rises. So it's really famous and everybody's there. Or that or the full moon. When it's full moon, you can see the reflection of the full moon in front of the temple. So it's just insane. But just any temple there is it's just crazy, and the trees are growing like on top of the temples, in between of the breaks. It's just insane. Yeah. So
yeah,
really good choice.
Yeah. Oh, I'm very jealous.
If you ever want to go, I can give you the tips and tricks of going there.
Please.
All right. And before we say goodbye to each other, can you tell everybody where they can know more about EHAB and about yourself?
Yeah. So if you visit ehab.co, so ehab.co, not .com, then you can find us on there. We've got a new newsletter out, which is insights.ehab.co. So insights.ehab.co, you can sign up, and we've got a weekly newsletter talking about, climate change, the built environment, and everything in between. So yeah, looking forward to hearing from any listeners who want to reach out and have a chat.
All right. Thanks so much, Josh. This has been enlightening. So appreciate you being here, and hope everything goes great with EHAB.
Thanks, Valentin. Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
All right. Have a great day.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
See you.
Thanks to our listeners. If you like this content, you can find past and upcoming episodes in ascworks.everse.com and at all of our Everse social media. We'd love to hear from you and recommendations for new content, so leave us a DM and we'll make sure to catch it.